I didn't even know that. For me, I guess it was more special. I'm thinking more about either than January 2010 when I was officially number one for the first time, or in, I think it was October 2008 when I was unofficially number one for the first time. So, but yeah, it's been a long time.
What would you say has been the highlight within those 10 years?
I mean, this is good, but I'm gonna be honest. Why are they using video of Magnus playing soccer? I'm a little bit confused. I'm just a little confused by that. Like, the video is fine, but why is Magnus like playing soccer in the video? It just kind of, I don't know. It just seems a little bit weird. It was very weird.
Yeah, I think the highlight still for me has been first half of 2019, where everything sort of clicked, and I had also my joint highest rating of all time. So yeah, I would say that was the highlight.
Have you ever felt like big pressure or even concerned or scared about losing the number one spot?
Oh, for sure. There have been a lot of games or even just moves that I could have lost the number one spot. For instance, in the match against Karana, there were a number of games where I was struggling. So the fact that it's been so long, there's obviously some luck involved there as well.
10 years consecutive world number one. How long do you tend to keep it?
I don't have any particular plans, but I'm at least happy that the gap is pretty wide again now after Karana lost a few points in Romania. So for the moment, it's not a big concern.
10 more years?
Unlikely, but we'll see.
Okay, that was okay. That was funny. Very, very impressive that Magnus has remained the top player in the world for the last 10 years. I have one game that I'm going to go over again, which was let me reload this page, which in many ways epitomizes his style and his rise to the top as well. So we're gonna go over one quick game. Let me change the scene. And the game that we're going to go over, let me put this back in dark mode, of course, for you guys. But the game that we're going to go over is, there we go, is the game between Timur Radjabov and Magnus Carlsen from 2013. So the Canada's tournament, which was held in 2013, was very, very important because the winner of the Canada's tournament gets to play in the World Championship match. Now, as we know, Magnus would go on to win the World Championship match in 2014 against none other than Vishwanathan Anand, the defending world champion, very convincingly in that match. So we're going to go over this game. This was one of the most crucial games for Magnus in winning the Canada's tournament in 2013 against none other than Timur Radjabov. If Magnus going into this game, I believe, was a half point out of first place. He was behind Vladimir Kramnik, and when he won this game, it allowed him to catch up and tie for first place, I believe, after this with none other than Kramnik himself. All right, so let's go over this game. So d4, knight f6 is played. c4, e6 is played here, knight c3, bishop b4. Not much that we need to talk about in terms of the opening specifically. Pretty standard. Queen c2, d6 is played. Now I think you can tell already by Magnus playing d6 at this point, he was in a situation where he felt like he had to win the game, because ordinarily Magnus probably would have played a more solid line like d5 here, but instead he plays d6. Knight f3, knight bd7, g3 castles, all pretty standard so far. Bishop g2, e5, castles, c6, rook d1, rook to e8, and here Timur makes the first surprising move, which is Timur decides to trade the pawns on e5. Now this is a completely reasonable move, and it definitely simplifies the game. At the same time, there are other moves as well, moves like pawn to a3, maybe moves like pawn to e4 as well, which look potentially very attractive. So he trades on e5 and now plays a3. And now here Magnus makes a very committal decision. He decides to trade the bishop for the knight on c3, which is kind of hard to do here. Ordinarily he would probably go bishop to f8, but Magnus in this game decides that he wants the imbalance by trading where he has a knight and a bishop for the bishop pair that white has with two bishops. Actually, you're right, we should flip the board. So it's very committal, because also long term, if white can say push a pawn and develop the bishop on the diagonal, it becomes very, very complicated here. So therefore it's very committal, probably not the best move, but again, going into this game, Magnus really needed a victory here. If Magnus did not win this game, probably he would not have been able to win the tournament. And this is the second thing I would add, is one thing that Magnus has always been very good at is the psychology behind the game. Now, in this tournament, Timur Radjabov was having a very miserable event. He was doing very poorly. He had lost a lot of games. He was not in the running to win the event. And so for that reason, Magnus also knew that Timur really wanted to make a draw and just go home. He wanted to say no and go home. Or he wanted to draw and go home, I should say. So therefore, Magnus trades and goes queen e7. So here, Timur plays b4, knight to b6, bishop to e3. Again, maybe not the best moves. Knight b6 again, a very dubious move by Magnus, but he understood the fundamental psychology in this game that Timur wanted a draw. Timur did not want to have to try to play for a win. He did not want to put pressure on Magnus. And that's why this works out very well here by playing knight b6, because as you guys can see, white is much better. If white plays a move like pawn to a4 to go a5, it's very, very hard for black to play here. When does Radjabov not want to draw and go home? Very funny. So he plays bishop e3. Magnus goes knight g4, and already you can tell the advantage is it's disapparating, or no, sorry, it's disappearing here. Sorry, this isn't Harry Potter. So knight g4 is played here. Knight to d2 is played. Pawn to f5 played by Magnus. And already, again, you see that once again, Magnus decides, I'm going to expand in the center, put the pawns on f5, e5. Long term, if I get my bishop to e6 and the rook to d8, it's very balanced here. So pawn to h3 played. Knight takes e3. Queen takes e3. Pawn to e4 played by Magnus. Again, a very logical move here to close the diagonal for this white bishop. As you can tell in this position, one of the big advantages white has, he's got this bishop on the diagonal. So ideas like b5 and even knight d2 here for that matter, try to open up the scope for this bishop on the diagonal. But when we get to this position after e4, the diagonal is now closed for the light square bishop, and it's much easier for black to play. So Timur plays rook a c1. Magnus goes bishop to e6. Timur plays queen c3. And now after rook a d8, as you can already tell, everything is left here. Everything has left the building everything has left the building here for Timur, because at this point black has finished the development. Rooks are in the center. Additionally, black has closed the diagonal for the light square bishop. And the third problem is that white has a weak pawn on c4. So if white ever goes c5, you go knight d5 and then e3 here, and it's very, very hard to play for white. So Timur plays bishop f1, a very passive move and a bad move at that. Not a good move at all. And again, as I said earlier, one thing that Magnus has always been very good at is understanding the psychology or the temperature of the situation. So by playing bishop f1 here, this again, this really does prove that Magnus understood what Timur was aiming for, which is to try and make a draw rather than trying to play a very sharp, complicated game. And here Magnus plays c5, a very nice move, by the way. What it does is it closes down the potential for white to ever play a move like c5. Now, as I said, c5 is not a great move in this position. Well, let's say black moves the bishop, white gets e3, and you got some position like this. Let's say the knight goes back. White can always use the bishop on this light square diagonal. So when you get to this position after bishop f1 c5, you'll now notice that the light square bishop has very limited scope. You can never, even if you play e3 here, there's no scope. You can't push this pawn and activate the bishop. So the bishop on f1 or e2, it looks nice, but it's behind a bunch of pawns here, no matter where it goes. So here, pawn takes pawn is played by Magnus, and now knight to a4 pawn takes pawn is played by Timur. Knight a4 played by Magnus. Again, very tough situation here. You probably would rather play e3 here, and it's not so bad for white. It's only very slightly worse, because even though there's a weak pawn on c4 here and black gets e5, it's still probably pretty close to balance if you can play like bishop e2, b6, and I don't know if knight b3 is the move. Something like this where rooks are going to be exchanged in the middle of the board. Instead, pawn takes pawn is played by Timur. Magnus goes knight a4. Queen b4 is played. And now knight takes c5 happens. So knight b3 is played by Timur. Rook takes rook. Rook takes rook. Magnus goes knight a7. And here Timur makes a very committal decision to trade the queens. Big mistake, but again, as we see here, you see that based on the tournament situation, Timur was in the mood to draw. He did not want to have to play or look for the best moves, because if he had, he probably would have played queen to b5 here. And white is actually better now because the knight is getting to d4, from whence It can attack the bishop on e6 and the pawn on f5. And additionally, you're going to get e3 and maybe c5 at some moment as well. Instead, he trades, goes to e3, king f7, bishop e2, b6. Very logical move, prevents white from ever pushing. You want to put the rook on c7 and target this weak pawn on c4. So rook to d8 is played here. Magnus goes knight c5, which kind of is a surprising move. To me, it seems more logical maybe to go rook c7, but knight c5 is reasonable. Timur goes knight d4. Magnus plays king to f6, and now king f1 is played. And here, Magnus goes rook d7. Timur checks. We get a few blocks. King e1. G6 played here, creating the connect 4. Again, not much to write home about. You can tell that black is very slightly better due to the weakness on c4 potentially, whereas the white bishop is very passive. There's no scope towards anything. It's just defending on c4. So black is maybe very slightly better. So h4 is played. Pawn to h6 played by Magnus. Rook c8. Bishop e6. Rook f8. So I'm just going to go through this pretty quickly up to a critical point. So we get to the position. I'm going to keep going. We get to a position basically like right around here. And the third thing that I was going to add, or probably the hallmark of Magnus's run from the start till now, is his ability to always fight and play on to the bitter end of the game. Because again, as you can tell, this position is a complete draw. There's nothing going on. Symmetrical structure on the king side. Also, black's pawns are on light square, so long term, most endgames should be okay. Let's say you end up with a light square bishop because you can touch the pawns. So bishop e6, rook f8, king e7, and we get a bunch of moves. And right here, this is a critical moment. So we get to this position where after rook to b7, we have another trade. Again, this looks like a dead draw. You see even number of pawns here, right? Even number of pawns, symmetrical. One weakness on c4. Now, one of the basic rules about endgames in chess, if you're trying to win or defend, is normally one weakness is not enough to win. In order to win the game, you normally need two weaknesses. One is usually not enough because if you can only target the one weakness, usually the weakness can be defended. But if there are 2 or 3 weaknesses, it's very hard to defend all the weaknesses. So king d2, king d6, king c3. Bishop f7, knight b3, king e5. I'll just keep going to a5 here. And again, you're in a situation here where if we look at the basics, white's pawns are all on dark squares. Black cannot really attack the pawns. Black's pawns, however, are on light squares. So in any kind of bishop endgame, white's bishop will be better than black's bishop, simply because of the color of the pawns. So we see all these repetitions, and the game keeps going on here. So bishop a4 gets played, knight d4, knight c5. We see all these waiting moves. And now you see check here, knight d4, knight e5, check. And you kind of wonder, well, how is it that you win this game? Like, it's just so dry. And this is where Timur makes a very, very committal decision. I don't know if you want to call it finger failure, like a slip, or just like he thought that it was a reasonable move to play because he thought that he could somehow trade. But he makes the very critical mistake of putting this pawn, which is on a dark square on a3, on a4 here. If Timur had simply waited with like knight d4, king d6, knight b3, it's very you kind of wonder if or maybe knight d4 maybe isn't the obvious move, but you kind of wonder if at some point you get a position. Wait, let's see. Let's not be tricky here. You kind of wonder here if Timur goes. I mean, there are many moves. There's knight d4, king d6, and now let's see this position. Let me try to remember why. I remember this was still a draw. F4, I guess, is the move. But basically, there are a couple ways that you can still draw, and this is where Timur plays a very strange move. He plays pawn to a4, and again, when you look at this endgame, you see one weakness on c4, right? But it's very well defended here, and of course, white can play like moves like knight d2 and draw, or knight d4 and f4 and draw. But with only one weakness, you can defend it. But after playing a4, Timur creates two weaknesses. As I said, with one weakness, generally, it's very hard to win in the endgame. But when you create the second weakness, this is a critical blunder. And it still is maybe a draw, but it becomes very tricky because you have to defend two points. So now king d7 gets played. Timur goes knight d4. We have a big long runabout, knight b5, king c5. Timur goes knight d4, bishop b8. Now black cannot capture on c4. If you take with the knight here, I go knight b3 check, and you actually lose your knight. If you go here, I take the knight. If you go back, I just take your knight. So you can't take. And additionally, if you take with the bishop here, we trade. And now I can go knight e6 check, king d5, knight f4 check, king c5. And actually after knight g6, white is the one pressing for the win because the pawn on h5 is super weak. So king c5, knight d4. So Magnus plays bishop e8. Very logical move, attacking the second weakness. So what you see here is you see two big weaknesses for white, c4 and b3. So here knight b3 is played, king to d6 played by Magnus, and now here Timur goes c5 and king c7 played by Magnus. If you were to take this pawn, white can make a draw very cleanly, because after knight a5, bishop takes a4, knight c4, the knights come off the board, and in this position it's a very easy draw, because when you look at it, all the pawns are on dark squares, so the black bishop cannot attack any of the white pawns here, whereas all of your pawns are on light squares, so it's a very easy draw. So Magnus goes king c7, king to d4 is played, knight to c6, king c3, Magnus goes knight e7, there's a trade. Timur goes knight d2, another very good move to play knight c4. There's takes, knight c4, king a6, and this is where knight a3 is played, king b7, knight c4, and I don't really want to go through the whole endgame in depth, so I'm not going to get super crazy about it. But after king a7 here, Timur plays this very strange move, king to d4. Now, this doesn't necessarily lose the game, but a better attempt would have been bishop c4. Try to get behind and attack all these black pawns on the light squares. And after a move like bishop e8, I think if white just brings the king in, it should be very close to a draw, I believe. Although again, as you see, it's not simple. Instead, he goes king d4, knight c6 is played, king c5, knight to e5, and this is where Timur makes the sort of the final mistake. Maybe it doesn't necessarily lose by force, but the big mistake when he plays knight c4. What Timur had to play in this position was he had to go back to d4, and after knight 6, king c5, and if black goes knight d7, now you can again go bishop c4 and sneak in behind and put a lot of pressure on these black pawns, which are all in the light squares. Instead, Timur goes knight c4, and now Magnus correctly spots knight to d3, and the correct move, I guess, is to take. It's actually, I think, the only move that doesn't lose here. Oddly enough, it feels like after take 6 you're probably losing, because again, this pawn is very fast. If you go here, bishop, maybe, I guess here there's bishop b5, knight 2 and a4, and you kind of worry about the white people pawns here and maybe losing the game. Now mind you, it's not 100% clear cut if it's losing by force, but after Timur plays king d4, Magnus finds the correct move, not knight takes f2, because after knight takes f2, knight takes a5, knight h1, bishop c4, there still are a lot of potential possibilities for white to be able to draw this game due to the pawns all being on the light squares. Also, the white king can come to f6 very, very fast. So instead, Magnus plays the perfect move, knight to c1. Bishop f1 is played by Timur, and after bishop b5, white can no longer move this knight, and we're going to end up in an endgame where black is just up a pawn with a knight versus bishop at some point. So knight takes a5 is played here. Now again, doesn't really change much. I mean, you can go king c3 here out of desperation, but after king a6, eventually you're going to end up losing, because when you go like king b2, there's going to be a knight d3 takes knight d2, and after king b6 with a4 and king c5, you're just long-term losing. So Timur plays knight a5 out of desperation, bishop takes bishop, knight c6, king b6, knight e7, and now Magnus with picture perfect precision goes knight d3, knight takes pawn, king c7, knight e7, and he goes bishop h3. Very important theme, that now with the pawns all in light squares, the bishop can actually guard all the pawns, and it's a very simple win. Knight d5, king d6, knight f6, and now Magnus plays bishop g4, locking it all up here. Everything guards each other, and you're just going to take the pawn on f2 next move and win the game. So very, very well played game by Magnus overall. That being said, he needed some luck, but you see that the psychology of knowing what his opponent was playing for definitely helped him, because when he made these slightly dubious moves, he knew his opponent was not going to be out to punish him, because his opponent simply wanted to go home and not have to play any more games of chess. So that's what I would that's what I would say about this game. Additionally, you see that Magnus grinding water from the stone, just keeping the game going on and on and on, and eventually his opponent Timur Rajabov cracked in this game. And I think that's probably the single biggest hallmark of Magnus's run as the world champion and #1 player in the world, is his ability to keep playing the game, never giving up. So this is the game that I want to go over that Magnus played. One of the most important games. If he didn't win this game, I don't know if he would have won the Candidates tournament. And if he doesn't win that Candidates tournament, he doesn't play a non in 2014, and who knows what the future holds. It could have been a completely completely different. The history would have been different.